In this lecture, we're going to talk about relativism. You've already seen that in Chapter 2, for example, that there are issues of diversity with regard to religion and religious approaches to ethics. We've also encountered the problem of a global perspective and the question of whether the values of Western philosophical traditions are merely Western. That's the problem of Eurocentrism that we talked about in the previous chapter. In this chapter, we're going to make sure you understand differences between descriptive relativism and metaethical relativism. We'll use terms objectivism and subjectivism again, which we saw in Chapter 1. Obviously, the term relativism is on the table. We'll talk about moral realism. Then we'll talk about arguments for and against and problems involving relativism. And we will also think as we go about the difference between relativism and pluralism, and try to understand how this connects to the idea of tolerance or toleration. So the approach to relativism that we're taking in this course and in this book is that relativism is a problem, meaning that relativism, it's not a final solution. It's not a standpoint that is simply affirmed and say, I'm a relativist. Instead, what we notice in philosophy is that when people talk about relativism, what they're doing is raising a set of challenges for morality, for ethics. It's a skeptical problem. So in terms of skepticism, and we'll talk more in a moment, the problem of skepticism is what do we know or how can we know? And one question about ethics is how do we know what's right and what's wrong, what's good and what's evil? How do we know? The skeptic says we can't know or we don't know, and so a version of relativism may be derived from this kind of skeptical problem. From that standpoint, we understand relativism as actually a metaethical issue. So again, relativism is not a normative theory. It doesn't say that something is right or wrong. Instead, relativism raises questions from the standpoint, from a standpoint that's sort of outside of normative theory. It's asking about the nature of ethics and moral judgment itself. And again, it's a problem. The various normative theories that we'll look at subsequent to this, those offer solutions. So the utilitarian says, well, I know what is right. We should promote the greatest happiness for the greatest number. The natural law theory offers a different approach. Kantian deontology offers a different sort of argument. In a way, those normative theories offer a concrete response to the metaethical question or the metaethical problem. The question is, of course, are there any universal values? Do they exist? And how would we know? Okay, so let's begin by making a distinction between descriptive relativism and a different kind of relativism. So here's the place to begin. It is just true that there are different values. Different people believe different things. Different cultures advocate different kinds of values. Different religions offer different ideas about value. Of course, we looked at in the previous chapter, in the previous lecture, the idea that there might be some common thread there, maybe the golden rule. But even if every culture adopts something like the golden rule, there's still interesting questions about how we apply the golden rule in concrete cases. So the two pictures we have on this slide have to do with child sacrifice. For example, in the ancient Greek and Hebrew world, it was sort of taken for granted that child sacrifice might occur. At least we read about stories and myths involving child sacrifice. The most famous one is the story of Abraham and Isaac from the Old Testament. And Abraham is commanded by God to sacrifice Isaac, his child. Of course, the angel intervenes. It's sort of a test. Will Abraham obey God up to the point of killing his own child? And then the angel comes down and says, hold on a minute. It was a test. It was an ordeal. Don't actually do it. But notice again, the assumption there is that it would make sense to sacrifice one's child. On the right, there's a different image of child sacrifice from Mesoamerica. And we can go around the world and we see that there are cultures in which child sacrifice occurs. Okay, descriptively true then, it's a fact that different cultures and different religions teach different things about, for example, child sacrifice. You might think about a bunch of other things: sexual morality, marital rules, what we eat, what we don't eat, behaviors. In some cultures they use forks, other cultures they use chopsticks. In some cultures we shake hands, in other cultures we bow. You get the idea. The fact of the matter is that different cultures and civilizations and religions practice different values. As a descriptive fact of the matter, relativism is true. The philosophy question is whether there is any further truth behind those descriptions. Can we say, and how would we know, that a culture that practices child sacrifice is wrong? How can we judge a different culture? That's a question of relativism. So, one normative conclusion that one might draw from the descriptive fact of relativism is that it is wise, it's prudent, it's smart to sometimes just go along with local customs. So, if you travel in Asian cultures and they give you chopsticks, just use the chopsticks, right? You get the idea. Well, of course, this is complicated. What if you go to a culture that practices child sacrifice? Or what if you move to a place where women are not given equal rights? How should you behave in those circumstances? It's an interesting set of questions. This bit of advice: when in Rome, do as the Romans do. This comes from the history of Christianity. Early Christians were asking questions about this problem, that in some places there are certain practices and in other places there are other practices. And the advice is, well, when you go to Rome, do what the Romans do. Play along. But does this mean when you're playing along or going along, does this mean that you actually approve of what you're doing? So, again, the chopsticks and forks issue is kind of superficial, but, if you use chopsticks when you go to an Asian culture, does this mean that you somehow think chopsticks are superior or are better? And what would that even mean? You get the idea here. One could play along, one could go along without believing what you're going along with. And then, is that even a good piece of advice? If you really believe something, like say that child sacrifice is wrong, and you happen to be in a culture where people are practicing child sacrifice, shouldn't you say something and do something? In which case, now we got this challenge of relativism. We know descriptively the cases that people believe different things. What basis do we have for judging those practices? And what would motivate someone to say, well, wait a minute, that's wrong. It's wrong that women don't have equal rights. It's wrong that there is slavery. It's wrong that child sacrifice is practiced. What's the basis for saying that it's wrong? If one says that practices are wrong, culturally diverse practices are wrong, there must be some basis in an objective or a realist claim about what's right and what's wrong, what's good and what's evil. Okay, so again, we talked about descriptive relativism. We've talked about playing along. So let's just be very clear now. Meta-ethical relativists, from a philosophical standpoint, will conclude that there are no universal or objective truths of ethics. Notice that's different than saying that different people practice different things. That's a descriptive fact of the world. The meta-ethical relativist makes this a much larger, much deeper, more comprehensive claim and says that there simply are no universal values. Related to this is an epistemological claim, which might say that even if there are universal values, human beings can't know what they are. That's a skeptical claim about knowledge. The first claim that declares that there are no objective values, that's not a claim about knowledge, that's a claim about the existence of those values. So you can see, in philosophy land, we'd call that first claim an ontological or metaphysical claim. The second claim, the skeptical claim, is an epistemological claim. Metaphysics and epistemology work together here. And basically, the meta-ethical relativist says there are no universal values, or even if there were such values, we couldn't know what they are. Now, response to this comes from a standpoint that we might call objectivism. We talked about this in an earlier chapter, objectivism. One way of understanding this claim, this idea about objective moral truth, is to say that there are, in fact, values that there is some object, some moral object out there in the universe somewhere. Plato called it the good, that there is something that exists that is right or wrong, that is the good versus evil, that justice is a thing that it has an objective existence. And related to this is the claim that we could know it. Now, an interesting set of questions. How would we know what that objectively true thing is? Well, again, now we go back. Remember in chapter 1, we talked about intuitionism. Some will claim that we have an intuition, that our conscience gives us access to this good thing. Others will claim that it's emotions. Maybe the emotivists might claim that there are objective values and that our emotions put us in touch with those values. And so it goes. You'll see that the normative theories that we talk about, utilitarianism, Kantian deontology, and natural law, claim that what they claim is true is objectively true, meaning that if people had the right understanding, that if they used their minds properly, they would see or know what those objective truths are. Again, interesting question about what it means to know what an ethical truth is. Related to this is another set of interesting claims about the nature of reality itself. So often we tend to think these days in the West that there is something objective about nature, that the natural world, that we can know the way it is, the way it's objectively structured, right? The natural world's an object and we can know it. Of course, there's an open question about this. Is nature knowable? And what do we know about nature? And you can see here again, we have another kind of relativist problem. From our standpoint as human beings, nature looks sort of like medium-sized objects, right? We see trees and squirrels and clouds, but we don't see atoms, we don't see cells, we don't see DNA, nor do we see really galaxies or the universe itself. But of course, natural science tells us that the world is made of atoms, that biology is made up of cells and DNA, and that there are galaxies beyond galaxies outside of our own galaxy. Of course, we need special instruments to see those things. So here's the problem. What is the truth of the natural world, and what instruments are required in order to see it and understand it? Maybe one interpretation of natural science is that it's just relative to our perspective. For human beings without special instruments, the world appears as a bunch of medium-sized objects. We call them squirrels and trees and so on. But maybe the really true perspective is the view of atoms. Well, is that the really true perspective, and which one is the true one? You can see how this gets to be very interesting in thinking about natural science. There's a bunch of interesting questions. For example, are species real things? Can we see a species? What is a species? You can hear how this gets interesting. Well, notice then how this then connects back to the ethics question. If there are supposedly ethical truths, ethical objects, what instruments do we need to see them, and how would we know them? Of course, the relativist says you can't see them or know them, or even that they don't exist. Okay, so a variety of ways that relativism gets explained and fleshed out and understood. In the middle of the slide here, cultural relativism will say that that values are relative to culture, that cultures, civilizations, languages, legal frameworks, historical epochs define for us what values are. Values are understood in terms of the practices of a culture. Of course, there's an interesting question. What's a culture? And how big or how small must a culture be in order for it to make sense and function? So the individualist or the subjectivist will say that actually a culture could be reduced down to one person. Could you have your own culture? Could you have your own set of values and practices? What's the difference between a subjectivist and individualist perspective and a perspective that brings in more than one person? And how do we understand the realm in which or toward which values are relative? Of course, history is also an issue because we know that cultures change over time. We also know that individuals change their values over time. So once we put time in the mix here, it gets even more and more complicated. One worry that philosophers have is that those who claim that values are relative to culture can't prevent a kind of slippery slope down towards individualism or subjectivism because, again, there's a really interesting, difficult question about where do we draw the line in terms of what counts as a culture. Could a family have its own culture? Could a couple of friends have their own culture? And could one have a culture of one's own? If you're interested, Wittgenstein, a philosopher in the 20th century, talked about this in terms of a private language problem. At any rate, you see some of the difficulties here. Okay, one of the authors associated with relativism is a philosopher from the 19th century, Friedrich Nietzsche. You can Google him. He's one of the more famous philosophers of the last couple hundred years. Nietzsche claimed that there are only perspectives. His view is called perspectivalism. It's a kind of view connected to that conversation we had about the natural world, that things are just a matter of perspective. When we look out the window, we see trees and squirrels. If we look through a microscope, we see a different perspective on things. If we look through a telescope, we see yet another perspective on things. That's all there is from Nietzsche's perspective. There are simply perspectives. Notice how we even use the word perspective to talk about this. There's nothing beyond the perspectives. There's no reality behind or beneath the thing we're looking at, because the subject, the perceiver, me or you, when we look out the window, we see things from our perspective. Notice, you can play on this and it's kind of interesting, the world looks different from the perspective of the tree, and it also looks different from the perspective of the squirrel, if there were such a thing. Well, so Nietzsche then further says that a lot of how we understand history and culture and ethics is that it's a struggle for power among and between perspectives. And he points out, for example, that there are class differences and that those with power have a certain perspective of things and those without power have a different perspective. He talks about the difference in perspectives between masters and slaves. It's pretty obviously that this makes sense, right? The master's interests, the master's perspective is to keep the slaves under his control. The slave's perspective is that the master is a bad guy, and the slave probably hates the master and wants to escape. And Nietzsche basically says that's it. That's all we see when we look at culture and we try to understand values. It's a matter of perspectives struggling for power. Okay, fast forward then 100 years later, Richard Rorty, philosopher, he taught at Stanford for a while. He tries to give a different, more subtle view than Nietzsche's view. But again, it builds on this kind of account that Nietzsche gave. Rorty suggests that all of our judgments are merely provisional, meaning they're partial. So it's a kind of similar problem with perspective. But Rorty basically makes this argument that when we think, when we judge, when we talk about ethics, all we can do is approach it from our vantage point, right? So same thing, like you're looking out the window, you see the trees and the squirrels out in your neighborhood, but you don't see things, you can't see things from the perspective of the squirrel or the tree. You don't see things all the time, 24 hours. You only see, in that snippet when you look out the window, nor do you see things from the vast perspective of history, right? Think of a tree, like a redwood tree or something that lives for hundreds of years. You see a snapshot of its existence. You don't see the whole thing. It's provisional. Our relationship to the world, to ourselves and to values is limited in this way, which leads Rorty to say that all we can do is sort of make partial progress. His approach can be called pragmatic or humanistic or anti-foundationalist. He's basically kind of a skeptic about any claim that we might know some objective truth about ethics and about politics and about life, because again, we only see a snapshot. We only see a perspective. Okay, now let's think about a couple arguments in favor and against relativism, and then In a moment or two, we'll look at a couple primary source authors. That's how we'll conclude the lecture here. We'll also talk about pluralism and look at some examples and a couple other issues. Okay, so arguments about relativism. One question is whether there really is diversity and what that means. So remember in the previous chapter, we talked about the golden rule as a possible unifying value. Golden rule means love your neighbor as yourself, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Basically care about other people. Is that really universal? And does that solve the problem of diversity? That's one of the questions that people have to think about in thinking about diversity, about relativism. Anthropologists, sociologists, historians can give us a lot of description that shows us that there is a lot of diversity. They can also, by the way, show us commonality, right? So you could have an anthropologist that goes and looks at different cultures and tries to find some things that are shared. Interesting set of questions about the descriptive facts of the matter. And we look to history and anthropology and sociology to understand that stuff. Second issue has to do with whether or not understanding diversity and thinking about relativism, whether or not that leads us to be tolerant and open-minded. Now, here's a confusion that people often have, is they think by saying, well, everything's relative, it's just a matter of your perspective. They think by saying that, that means we shouldn't judge. The problem is, if there is no objective standpoint that says it's wrong to judge other people's cultures, then there's no basis for being tolerant and open-minded. It could be, right? This is actually Nietzsche's view, kind of. It could be that if you affirm perspectivalism, basically you might just say, well, my perspective is the one I like, and I'm going to force you to believe it. And so there could be a struggle for will to power, what Nietzsche called. There could be a struggle among the perspectives, and basically in Nietzsche's view, the slave submits to the master forces the slave to adopt his perspective. So there's an interesting problem here about the value of toleration and open-mindedness. Probably, if you are committed to toleration and open-mindedness, probably you believe that liberty is an important value. To claim that liberty is an important value is not relative, right? The founders, we talked about this in a previous lecture, the founders who say that Thomas Jefferson, we have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The right to liberty is not a relative value. Of course, a critic might object and say, well, that's just Thomas Jefferson's opinion, and that just is the opinion of people in the West in the last couple hundred years, because, of course, we know it's true that not everyone historically believed there was a right to liberty. And so it goes. Last issue here is about uncertainty and skepticism. Now, here's one of the, we have to be subtle and careful here. If we claim that we don't know something, does that mean it's impossible to know that thing? Interesting question. Maybe we don't know yet, or right now, what the truth is about ethics, but if we were better educated and did more research, maybe we could discover that truth. So there's an interesting question here about what we mean when we're talking about skepticism about values. Objectivists claim that there is a truth and we could know it if we just did the work and figured it out. Objectivists will claim that we can make progress in knowledge about ethics because there is some truth and knowledge to be had. Full-fledged relativists will deny that we can make progress because skeptical relativism says there's nothing to be known. There's no progress to be made. Okay, one of the challenges of relativism, philosophers have pointed this out since the time of Socrates, is that relativism seems to include a kind of contradiction. As philosophers will say, it's self-contradictory. It seems to undermine itself. Look at the picture in the slide here. Nothing is written in stone, which is written in stone. Therefore, what it says is false, because something is written in stone, namely that nothing is written in stone. That kind of paradox can be found in thinking about relativism. Here's how it works. If we claim that all truths are relative, we have to be claiming at least one thing is true, namely that all truths are relative. In which case, it's not true that everything is relative. You see the problem? Think back now to the issue of toleration and liberty, right? People want to say, well, relativism is true, therefore we should be tolerant. But notice that therefore doesn't follow. It only makes sense to say we should be tolerant if we believe that liberty is a value, in which case it's not true that all things are relative, because we are claiming at least that liberty is not relative. Think about this if you're not following me. Puzzle over, it's supposed to be weird. It is a contradiction. Okay, we already mentioned objectivism. Another concept that's used in thinking about a response to relativism is moral realism. The picture on the right gives us a kind of representation of Plato's story about this. This is not a class on Plato, so we're not going to get into it. But anyway, understand that Plato and others in the philosophical tradition offered accounts of the reality of ethical objects. So Plato thought that the good was a real thing. We could know it. We direct our minds towards this thing called good, and we would see it, we would know it, we would understand it, there would be truth about it. The divine command theory, for example, claims that if we just understood God's commandments, we would know that they are real and objectively true. The normative theories we will look at make claims about the reality of value. In the natural law tradition, for example, which is connected to that Thomas Jefferson bit about the right to liberty, the claim is made that there are rights and that they are self-evident. It's self-evident that we have these rights. They're real, and we can just see and know them if we use reason and look at them. Those kind of claims are what philosophers call claims that appeal to moral realism, that there's a reality there. Notice, the relativist offers a skeptical response to this. So in a sense, relativists are not realists. They don't believe that morality has a reality behind it. Again, morality from the relativist perspective is just opinion, perspective, and so on. Okay, an issue that arises, and we talk about in the chapter in connection with relativism, is pluralism. We talked about pluralism in the last chapter as well. One of the questions about the reality or the objectivity of values is about whether there is one thing that is true morally or more than one. Plato thought there was one thing called the good, and everything else in morality was understood in relation to that thing called the good. That view is similar to what we see in some religious traditions, monotheistic divine command traditions, that say that goodness is related to God's will, that God sort of zaps the good into existence, and there's one thing or one source of all this. Pluralists are somewhere in between relativists and objectivist realists like Plato and divine command theorists. The pluralist might say that it's not true that all values are relative. Rather, there are a few different values that are in conflict with each other, but those values, the plural values, the set of several values, that they're real, that they're objective, that we know that they're true. And part of the issue about relativism can be explained away from this perspective by claiming, like child sacrifice, back to where we started, claiming that, well, it's the person who believes in child sacrifice may also believe that it's wrong to kill, but have some other value that leads them to think that in certain circumstances it might be okay to kill a child. For example, in the Abraham and Isaac case from the Old Testament, it might be that obedience to God is in conflict with the value that says it's wrong to kill your child, and that's a standard interpretation of that story. There's a conflict of values. Remember, the title of this course is Contemporary Conflicts of Values, and these conflicts occur because there may be more than one thing that's good. We know these things are good, so it's not relativism, but it turns out, it's not skepticism, but it turns out that we have a difficult time resolving conflicts of values. One way of describing this may be to use this phrase, soft universalism. And this soft universalism is a kind of pluralism that will say that there's a certain set of universal values, but these get applied and developed and understood in different ways and embodied in different ways in different cultures. We'll see, and we talk in the chapter about Martha Nussbaum, her views can be understood as a kind of soft universalism. Her approach is called the capabilities approach. I'll show you, and you'll see in the chapter some of what she talks about. Here's Nussbaum's approach, that to be human is to be committed to a variety of things. And different cultures will structure that variety of things in different ways. For example, it's good to love your children. It's also good to obey God, that conflict we talked about. And there's a bunch of other things. So we have to figure out, and different cultures will figure out how we balance conflicting values. So here's a couple of lists that we can identify as a kind of pluralist approach to ethics. David Ross gives us what he calls prima facie duties. Prima facie means on the face of it. So these are things that are good. There are duties. We have a duty to be faithful, to fix things that have gone wrong, to show gratitude, to be beneficent. It means to be kind and generous. We have a duty not to do harm, non-maleficence. We have a duty to treat people fairly. That's the duty of justice. And we have a duty of self-improvement. Okay? It turns out these duties can be in conflict, right? So if you have a duty, for example, to treat people fairly, justice, but you also have a duty to be faithful to your family members, then you might have a conflict. This would be called nepotism, for example. Should we show favors to our family members? Does faithfulness to our family require us to treat our family members better than others? In which case, now we have a conflict with the value of justice. Notice, this is not exactly relativism. Instead, it's a conflict of values based on a set of values that are objectively good, right? It is good to be faithful. It is good to be fair. But we can end up with a conflict. Nussbaum, Martha Nussbaum, who we already looked at, here's a list of 10 capabilities that she gives us. And again, these can be fleshed out in different ways in different cultures. Different cultures will emphasize them, and there can be conflicts. This is pluralism. Again, Nussbaum suggests that these things, this list of 10 things, are objectively good. It's just a matter of different ways of manifesting them in different cultures. Okay, so in this chapter, there are two primary source readings, one from Louis Poyman and another from John Locke. Louis Poyman argues against relativism. So his argument involves a discussion of ethnocentrism. So it's an important term to get on the table here. Ethnocentrism is to claim that your values are better because they're yours. Poyman agrees that that's not a good idea. So he agrees that ethnocentrism is wrong. To believe that your culture, that your religion is superior just because it's yours, it's a dumb idea from his standpoint. Poyman suggests that that one of the things that motivates relativists is to argue against ethnocentrism. So the argument would go something like this. Imagine there's someone, they're a cultural superioritist. They believe that their culture is superior. A relativist might say, no, you're wrong. No culture is superior to any other. Cultures just have different values. It's all relative, says the critic of ethnocentrism. It makes sense, but Poyman points out that's a weak argument. Why? Because, again, relativism can't give us any reason to argue against, really, the ethnocentric superioritist, right? The person who thinks that they're better than others. Because relativism doesn't give us any basis to argue whatsoever. Relativism can't say that anything's true or false, so really, the relativists can't say that ethnocentrism is wrong. You get the idea. We talked about this with regard to toleration and liberty. So Poyman raises this question, who's to judge? And Poyman suggests that basically we are. And we judge based on our best understanding of what's true about ethics. And here's one of the things we might say, that it is true that it's wrong to be ethnocentric. It's wrong to think that your values are superior to others without a whole lot of other work that shows something about the objectivity of values. Now, again, here's the problem. The relativists might object. What if you just claim that your values are superior, and then every argument against you say, no, 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 here's the story, and you keep claiming your values are superior. And the relativist says, well, how do you know, how do you know, how do you know? And so the conversation goes. Poyman opts on the side of what we might call soft universalism again. He thinks that there are ways to know what's true and what's right and what's wrong. We use reason. We make arguments. We look for internal contradictions. And Poyman basically thinks that through that process, it's possible to come up with a story about what's right and what's wrong. Now, Poyman's a philosopher, and in the philosophical tradition, that's exactly what philosophers did, from Plato on through the utilitarians, the deontologists, the natural law tradition. Philosophers have done what Poyman suggests, namely to keep thinking, to keep arguing, and to do their best to clarify what they know about values. Notice, this is, or contains, the seed of an argument against ethnocentrism. The ethnocentric person who just says, my values are superior, does so without thinking. They haven't actually thought through the whole question about what is true or what's right or what's wrong. Poyman says, after we do that, then we might decide that some of our values are better. Let's go back to the issue about the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If you remember in the last chapter, we talked about the critique that says that's Eurocentric. It would be Eurocentric, ethnocentric, to say that our values are right just because they're ours, right? That's not even an argument. It just says, I'm right and you're wrong. But Poyman suggests that if we think carefully about rights and liberty and a bunch of other stuff connected with all of this, then we might, in fact, conclude that the idea of having a right to life, liberty, and happiness is not a dumb idea. It's actually a good one that can be supported from the standpoint of ethics and using reason to think about this stuff. But notice if we make that kind of argument, it's not just ethnocentric. It's actually a thoughtful argument that involves, and it will involve, a lot of qualifications and careful thinking. That's Poyman's view. Okay, on the other side of things here, we have John Locke. Locke actually is a friend of mine. He was my dissertation advisor, so I know a lot about his work, and I've talked with him about these issues. Locke argues that relativism can be good and beneficial. So in a sense, he agrees with Richard Rorty, who we looked at earlier. They sort of are in the same camp in terms of the way we think about contemporary philosophy. One of Locke is not a full-fledged relativist who just says anything goes. But Locke thinks that there is a problem that relativism can help us solve. And that's the problem of what he calls dogmatism. Dogmatists are like those ethnocentrists who just say, I know what's right, and here it is. And they don't really give an argument. They just claim, I just know it's right. Self-evidently true, it's right. And Locke thinks that that is unreflective and really not helpful. Now, some kinds of dogmatists will claim that they know things self-evidently or through intuition. The intuitionists make this kind of claim. And Locke says, really, how do you know? How do you really know? And he asks this question, what if someone says, it's not evident to me, right? So someone says it's self-evident that we have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And someone says, I don't get it. Why is that true? Well, now we need philosophy, right? We need some argument. We need to explain what all this stuff means and start giving some arguments and think about some examples. And turns out there's a lot more to it than just dogmatically claiming that you know what's right and what's wrong. Locke uses the word relativism to point towards that problem. We started this lecture talking about relativism as a problem. You raise the problem, you say, well, how do you know? And what justifies you in claiming that you think something is right or wrong, good or evil? We need a lot more conversation there. Now, Locke also is kind of a bit of a skeptic. And here's one way that he expresses this kind of skepticism. He suggests that we never have full access to the truth. We only see things partially. Remember Nietzsche and perspectivalism? Rorty also had a kind of perspectival view. Locke has something similar going on. We only see part of the world. we look out our window, we see squirrels and trees, right? But we don't see what's beyond that. We don't see the perspective. We don't see what things look like from the perspective of the squirrel or the tree or nature itself or the species, right? We only see partially. In which case, Locke argues, let's be a little careful in judging. Some similar argument to what Rorty said. Part of the issue here is also that our perspective is determined and informed by our interests, our education, our cultural background, right? Some cultures look out the window and see a squirrel and they're like, dinner, right? Ooh, something delicious we can hunt. Vegetarians look out the window and they don't see dinner at all. They're not thinking about eating the squirrel. Notice how our values will impact how we see things. Locke also suggests, and he's actually written a bunch of essays about this, suggests that human nature is not one thing. It's an interesting claim about this. We'll see when we get to the natural law tradition. The natural law theorists want to claim that there is an essence of human nature, and Locke's is reluctant to affirm the idea that there's some human essence. He says that different people find different things interesting, satisfying, frightening, appealing. Our minds work in different ways, our bodies function in different ways, the world looks different, and our understanding of ourselves and the world varies depending on what he calls our human natures, plural human natures. And Locke thinks that's really cool. So again, I know the guy, and he's one of these people who loves to tell stories about the way that different people do things. And isn't it interesting? Back to our chopsticks and forks where we started this lecture, right? It's kind of cool that some people eat with chopsticks and other people eat with forks. It's kind of fascinating the way that different people cook different foods and eat different things. It's kind of interesting how people behave in different ways. This doesn't mean that everything is equal, right? It doesn't mean that anything goes. There's going to be some stuff that's pretty obviously wrong, like preventing people from embodying their values. Again, dogmatism and despotism from Locke's view are wrong. It's wrong to impose. So Locke then leaves us with a kind of toleration. And there may be a paradox, and I've argued with him about this, and people have pointed this out, that if you are a full-fledged relativist, it's not clear how you argue in favor of toleration. But Locke's argument goes something like this, that basically when we're in the middle of things, it's better to do that when in Rome, do what the Romans do, approach, play along, try to understand where other people are coming from, and do your best to allow other people to satisfy their own interests in their own way. I mentioned earlier in the lecture that liberty, the affirmation of liberty, seems to be an important feature of a claim about toleration. And if we had a lot more time, we'd look at some of Locke's other writings on this. And it turns out that he is an advocate of liberty. He defends this idea based on a claim about the importance of human liberty. But of course, take that one step further, if people are free and part of our human nature is to be free, this means that we're going to embody that freedom and manifest it in different ways, which means that some people will use chopsticks and other people will use forks. And so it goes. Okay, so you can see the arguments that we have on the table in terms of relativism. Again, just to conclude, one important thought. For philosophers, relativism is a problem. You can't just simply affirm it. Rather, it shows up as a challenge. And the question is there anything else? Are there any objective values at all? Maybe liberty is one of them. Maybe that pluralistic list of values that we saw with Ross and Nussbaum, maybe there's more than one thing. And there'll be an open question and a lot of thinking to do about how we integrate and make sense of all that.